There has always been a keen interest on my part in the field of science, and this led to my career in the engineering field. Engineering requires the utmost accuracy. Being wrong leads to dire results. Therefore, each endeavor must follow scientific principles that have been proven in real-world experiments and applications. After retiring from engineering in 2010, the ongoing political battle over global warming and now climate change captured my interest mainly because people who have no background in science are absolutely convinced that humans are the cause of catastrophic climate change, and further that humans could somehow control the climate. Because many of you have already yawned and are beginning to wish you were not here, I put this presentation together with you in mind. You are the ones that need to become more knowledgeable and informed. I hope that this will help to enlighten you on how far the science has progressed, but more importantly, how much further it needs to progress to satisfy the scientific requirements before it can be labeled settled science. The basis for this presentation comes from centuries of scientific research from all over the globe. For the last 10 years, I've read scientific papers, journals, textbooks, and research articles on this subject. Because climate science includes so many disciplines, it is complex beyond imagination. I know that there are a number of pilots in the audience, and for you, I say that weather and climate is part of your skill set. You have experienced firsthand how weather rapidly changes both locally and globally. Aviation weather charts have always been far more accurate than weather on TV news channels. This is due in part because pilots report the weather continuously during flight, so weather is a combination of science and up-to-the-minute corrections from visual reports. So let me get right to the heart of the climate matter. Global climate and weather is bogglingly complex and chaotic. Mankind does not, and likely never will, have the ability to change or control climate. There is not now, nor in the past, any creditable evidence whatsoever that points to a remote possibility of this. The study of the solar system over centuries by brilliant scientists has led to better human understanding of the universe and is without doubt as important as any other human progress over time. We need to acknowledge this above all else to understand why we need to continue the research on Earth climate. The United Nations International Panel on Climate Change has claimed for many years that Earth's climate has been warming and that the warming is catastrophic. They claim that a minuscule amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is produced by humans has caused dangerous changes in global climate. Politicians worldwide were quick to accept this flawed and unproven theory. Without any proof, these misguided politicians have imposed rules, regulations, and laws upon their respective countries that are exceedingly expensive, unnecessary, and punitive. The following presentation is an update on the many contentious factors on the climate issues. There remains much to be resolved with respect to scientific evidence before current postulates on global climate change theories should become the basis for climate policies around the world. Enjoy the video. United Nations Climate Change Hypothesis, a change in global or regional climate patterns attributed largely to the increased levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by the use of fossil fuels. This graphic depicts the IPCC hypothesis, which suggests that with less CO2, the Earth's climate would be more stable. This is not supported by history because Earth climate has always gone through warm periods and ice ages. The hypothesis also states, as shown on the right graphic, that a buildup of human-produced CO2 will cause the Earth to warm, and this warming will be catastrophic. This is not supported by any experiments or by historical records. That which can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed with evidence. Global climate has been controlled by the sun and natural phenomena for billions of years. This slide shows current theory of the carbon cycle, natural processes and exchanges. These processes and exchanges take place so slowly that it is inconceivable that human activity could, over the course of a few years or even millions of years, cause any change in climate. This slide depicts the global energy budget of Earth under the so-called present-day climate conditions, whatever they may be. I cannot begin to describe the audacity of some scientists to even attempt to put numbers having any accuracy into an energy budget as complex as our world. But I admit you have to start somewhere. When you learn how much information is assumed in climate science, you begin to wonder why politicians are so bent on spending trillions of dollars to solve a problem not yet proven to exist, other than on computers that are calculating made-up numbers. There will be more on this later. On this chart, the majority of data is assumed, not measured. The assumed data is adjusted by scientists to obtain a balance of the assumed incoming and outgoing solar radiation requirements to meet the theory. Seems simple enough indeed. Another chart showing the estimated incoming and outgoing solar. Once again, you have to start somewhere, but keep in mind the data is assumed to be correct, not proven to be correct. Now for a very short science overview of the global greenhouse theory. For those that believe it is human-made CO2 that drives the temperature of the globe, please follow closely. Earth's atmosphere is made up of many constituents. Lucky for us, oxygen and carbon dioxide are present or we would not be here. I want to focus on carbon dioxide because it is the gas that some scientists claim is causing catastrophic global warming. Other greenhouse gases will be discussed later. First, we have the carbon atom, upper left of slide. It is made up of 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. Together, these make up an atom that is about 500,000 times smaller than the thickness of a human hair. Here is the culprit that is forcing politicians to spend trillions of dollars: carbon dioxide. Humans are responsible for a very minuscule amount of atmospheric CO2 production. Most of the carbon dioxide that is produced by humans comes from the combustion of fossil fuels, but every living thing produces CO2. Only oxygen is more important for human life on Earth. All plant life would cease to exist without CO2. More, not less CO2 is better for the planet. The climate alarmist media tell us that carbon dioxide is the cause for both excessive cooling and excessive heating of the Earth's atmosphere. This slide shows the present theory of the carbon cycle on Earth. The theory holds that for all of eternity, carbon has been exchanged between the Earth, the oceans, and the atmosphere. Long before humans ever roamed the Earth, other creatures likely depended on this cycle to survive. Scientific theory assumes that carbon is exchanged between Earth, oceans, and the atmosphere. The rate of this exchange is unknown, and at this point, any assumptions are only conjecture. Now I want to shift the focus over to the atmosphere, where it really becomes complicated. This slide is one of my favorites because it consolidates much important information. Many people forget that nearly all weather on Earth happens within 6 miles of sea level. As a matter of fact, when I was piloting, it was normal practice to fly above the most severe weather effects at around 10,000 feet, which is 2 miles. The red line on the chart shows the standard temperature lapse rate as you ascend into space through the troposphere, tropopause, and stratosphere. This temperature lapse rate has been documented by balloons, aircraft, and satellite. The lapse rate changes with latitude, longitude on Earth, with the north and south poles having the most temperature change with altitude change. As you know, temperature variations are prevalent everywhere in the Earth's atmosphere, regardless of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Here are the major greenhouse gases: water vapor, not droplets, carbon dioxide, ozone, and methane. This slide shows greenhouse gases adjusted for global warming potential relative to CO2. It is absolutely clear that water vapor, not CO2, dominates the warming potential. This is further explained later in this presentation. Now look at the upper graphic. Nitrogen and oxygen dominate the atmosphere's makeup. The greenhouse gases are a minuscule part of the atmosphere. This slide shows in graphical form that atmospheric carbon dioxide gas content is so small it is invisible on a bar chart. The lower chart shows that human-caused CO2 emissions contribute only 0.117% to the total greenhouse effect, a minuscule amount. At the present time, the UN panel claims that the CO2 in Earth's atmosphere is 420 parts per million by volume. Only 0.117% of the 420% is said to be human cause. That calculates to be 0.49 parts per million volume, a minuscule amount. To give you an idea how minuscule the human contribution is said to be, look at this slide. The lower right-hand corner shows a single dot, which represents human-caused global warming. This slide shows it even better. The greenhouse gases are depicted by 16,000 symbols, droplets, and dots. Man-made CO2 is 12 dots, or 1.4% of the greenhouse gases. Water vapor dominates at 95%. It appears extremely likely that water is the controlling greenhouse gas, and CO2 has a very slight effect. The human contribution is unlikely to have any effect, and this is explained later. This slide shows why CO2 content of the atmosphere is hard to be so easily characterized as being the cause of catastrophic warming dominated by the contributions of human emissions. World oceans and waterways contain huge amounts of CO2. During cold atmospheric conditions, oceans and waterways absorb large amounts of CO2, and during warm periods, they release large amounts of CO2. How this cycle works is not fully understood by scientists, but one thing is obvious. Water is a huge CO2 reservoir. This chart, used frequently by alarmist IPCC scientists and the media, shows CO2 at a current level of around 420 parts per million and shows the increase since the year 1800. The situation is very different when viewed over a longer time frame. In fact, it shows that CO2 levels are the lowest in the past 600 million years. Further, it shows that temperature and CO2 are not codependent as claimed by the IPCC. Earlier in this presentation, you viewed a similar depiction of the temperature profile of the atmosphere. Scientists Roonan and Michael Connolly researched several years of data from weather balloons that were sent into the atmosphere to measure temperature and pressure profiles. Their research showed that lapse rates in temperature from Earth's surface to the outer edge of the tropopause were consistent with those shown on this slide and showed no warming at any point, as has been claimed by the computer model results used by the IPCC to predict climate change. Real-time data is hard to refute. It is abundantly clear how variable temperatures are around the globe as a result of orbital distances and orbital positions with respect to our sun. The sun is the only source of energy with the ability to control climate on Earth. For a group of scientists to claim CO2 will accomplish warming of Earth to catastrophic levels is ingenious at best. Also, to make the claim that a single averaged temperature proves this also defies logic. Before discussing alternative theory, I think it is important to emphasize that the facts show that the science is not settled regarding the CO2 hypothesis. The worldwide frenzy to establish this as certain is nothing more than politics. The following is an alternative to the CO2 hypothesis that has far more scientific basis than the CO2 theory. It too requires further research and study. And now the alternative climate change hypothesis. A change in global or regional climate patterns attributed to the sun's solar activity. It is hard to understand how scientists and other deep-thinking theorists could embrace the theory of CO2-caused warming when eons of evidence points to the sun as the source of all energy for Earth. A short or long-term change of climate seems impossible without a huge source of energy, and the sun certainly proves this every day and night when temperatures change drastically. Science has not ignored this fact. Sunspots have been studied and proven to affect solar output. Studies have shown that solar activity follows cycles, and these have been documented as shown on this slide. The cosmic ray theory postulates that a stronger solar magnetic field means fewer cosmic rays and fewer clouds on Earth, and vice versa. Cloudy skies equals a cool Earth. Clear skies equal a warm Earth. A very informative chart showing the theory and how temperature correlates with cosmic rays. A chart showing the scientific theory that is named after Svensmark. This slide shows how the sun's cosmic rays are scattered around the globe. The Svensmark theory clearly explains phenomena that is readily confirmed by physical science as compared to the CO2 theory that is not visually or scientifically proven. Another interesting and proven fact supporting the sunspots theory is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, shown here. Surface temperatures change on a 40 to 60 year cycle, conforming to the sunspot cycles. This kind of data is hard to refute because it has been documented with real-world measurements. It is interesting that most of the sun's radiation is blocked by the Earth's atmosphere. This explains why Earth, unlike other planets in the universe, supports life. Of course, water, oxygen, and CO2 helps. This is a very good illustration of the wavelengths from the sun and how they are blocked by the Earth's atmosphere. This slide demonstrates better than any other explanation why CO2 is not a threat to Earth. It shows radiation transmitted by the atmosphere and different wavelengths absorbed by the 5 most important greenhouse gases. Focus on the amount of absorption potential for water vapor compared to carbon dioxide. Also, it is notable that once the absorption spectrum is consumed, additional gases cannot be absorbed and therefore are not effective in acting as a greenhouse gas. These excess gases find their way into space without impacting Earth's temperature. The bottom line for all of this information is shown on this graph. Temperature of the atmosphere correlates with the sun, not hydrocarbon use. How the cockamamie idea that minuscule amounts of CO2 controls Earth's temperature and could lead to catastrophic warming has become accepted science is beyond my comprehension. It is not supported by science. As you will see later in this presentation, the computer is unable to support the thesis even with manipulation of input data. Now let's take a look at temperature versus carbon dioxide. Temperature is always in a state of flux locally, regionally, and internationally. It varies from seasons, night, day, altitude, and many other factors. CO2 levels are variable only over long time periods. It is unlikely that the two are coupled in any way. Another aspect of global climate is the characteristics of air masses. This issue alone begs the question of how average global temperature could possibly be accurate enough to have any scientific use. The odds of reaching a true average is impossible, considering that every temperature is not recorded at the same moment, and results would all require adjustments for altitude, longitude, latitude, etc. Even if it was possible, scientists adjust that average with manipulated data in a feeble attempt to make sense of the results. Imagine attempting to put meaningful information on topographic Earth features like these into a computer program with any meaningful accuracy. Here is another example. The Coriolis effects are real, but how is it averaged globally? How clouds form is very, very complex, and as far as I know, is not something a computer will ever be able to model. However, clouds likely have the most single largest effect on global temperature, dwarfing any CO2 effect. The jet stream is yet another part of the overall climate system that escapes scientific ability to predict its behavior. How to model the effect is extremely difficult and uncertain. There is little doubt that the jet stream affects weather patterns and global climate. The question is, in what manner and what controls the behavior? Scientists have for centuries studied the effect of volcanoes on Earth's climate. Many have cited the large volume of CO2 emanating from volcanoes as a factor, but ash and sulfur are likely more damaging to the atmosphere. CO2 has a net positive effect for Earth. This slide tells it all and is the best summary of the CO2 effect. CO2 has never approached levels in our atmosphere that cause harm to plant life or human life. On the contrary, more CO2 means a healthier planet. While we refer to ice ages usually as the glacial periods that have happened routinely every 100,000 years during the last million or 2 years, the whole of the last several million years has actually been a relative ice age. Before that, during diversity growth from sea life through dinosaurs, the planet was much warmer with little ice at all, sea levels hundreds of feet higher, and in general, green from pole to pole. It was green, not dry desert, because the Earth was fertilized by CO2 levels 10 to 20 times present. One thing to bear in mind is that the atmospheric concentration of CO2 got down to 180 parts per million during the glacial periods of the Ice Age the Earth is currently in. The Hausaline is an interglacial in the Ice Age that started 3 million years ago. Plant growth shuts down at 150 parts per million, so the Earth was within 30 parts per million of a disaster. CO2 is not a pollutant. It is critical for life. A doubling of CO2 would greatly improve crop yields and forest growth. Decreasing CO2 to half the current percent would be catastrophic. Plants would die, humans would starve. About 600 million people, 7% of today's population, are alive today who wouldn't be if carbon dioxide had not risen in the last century. This is a very interesting slide that graphically depicts trends in the United States from 1970 through 2017. It is telling that aggregate emissions from fossil fuel combustion systems were reduced by 73%. Nothing makes the case for fossil fuels more than this factor, considering that the trend is likely to continue downward even though current emissions are far below health impact requirements. This graph shows what the economic benefits to humans has been as a result of increasing CO2 levels. Now let's take a look at the flawed computer models used to justify the CO2 climate change hypothesis. Here are just a few of the parameters that must be considered when analyzing climate. For those of you that do not use these parameters in daily life, stop reading the slide. For those few that do tell everyone else in the room how complex it is to manipulate these parameters, a computer helps, but data must be entered accurately, and adjustments will always corrupt the answer. Programming the software used for climate models is a horrendously complex task that likely will never be absolutely accurate to mirror real-world climate. With each improvement in human understanding of the climate problem comes exponential increases in computational requirements. This graphic is a very simplified example of an integrated assessment model of global climate. Data management in computers starts with a single bit, 1 or 0. As we all know, advancement in computing has been mind-numbing. The laptop computer used to prepare this presentation has a 1 terabyte hard drive, once thought to be impossible in a computer, let alone a laptop. It is hard to get my head around the hard drive required to manage a realistic model of the atmosphere. That is but one of the reasons why scientists have yet to compute any rational results. Here is a comparison of the comprehensiveness and complexity of a variety of climate models in use today. A more interesting comparison would show a circle that has the possibility of producing a remotely accurate result. None of the programs used today have ever accurately hindcast the global climate, let alone forecast the future climate. These two graphics show a generic problem with the current greenhouse warming computer models. The models show a warming that is not reproduced by real-world measurements. Here is another head-scratching example that makes you wonder why would IPCC scientists make outrageous claims of global CO2 causing climate change. Computer models have never come close to predicting accurate results. This graph shows actual and model results from 102 climate models in 32 institutional groups. Computer model theory versus real-world observation. The two do not meet. Now I'd like to turn my attention to fossil fuels, the enemy of the CO2 clan. Fossil fuels are indispensable for human survival. Fossil fuels have lifted billions of humans out of poverty. They enable labor-saving and life-protecting technologies such as air conditioning, modern medicine, cars, trucks, and airplanes. Fossil fuels made possible electricity for heating, lighting, manufacturing, and other processes. Without fossil fuel, we would still be in the dark age. I believe that energy efficiency has been one of the most important factors in the improvement of the human condition. The three industrial revolutions have lifted mankind from using wood for cooking and home heating to a world of automobiles, airplanes, electricity, computers, cell phones, etc. None of this would have been possible without fossil fuel and especially coal. This slide makes it abundantly clear how fossil fuels were the driving force during the three industrial revolutions. This slide showing the United States energy consumption from 1775 until 2009 is a dramatic example of human progress fueled first by coal and later natural gas and petroleum. One of the remarkable things that began to happen during the third industrial revolution was dematerialization. This is a great example of efficiency at play. One cell phone doing the job of multiple devices, but using far less energy than the combined total of the other devices. The Preston curve shows the incredible advance in life expectancy throughout the world when compared to GDP. Nearly every country with high life expectancy has abundant energy resources per capita, and coal is the dominant fuel. A very telling slide that shows the real-world energy picture. Renewables will never be able to meet total global energy demand, but the propaganda otherwise continues to reverberate throughout the world media. You will never see this documentary in any media, along with more like it that would fill a football stadium. This slide compares energy costs for nuclear, coal, gas, wind, and solar. Every country that is attempting to convert to wind and solar have seen electricity prices skyrocket with no end in sight. Here is a great slide showing sources and uses of energy in the United States in 2016. The blocks on the left are the sources of energy, and the blocks on the right are the uses of energy. Focus on the upper right-hand side at the gray box. This box represents the energy lost in the heat to power conversion. For me, the rejected energy block is where U.S. money should be spent rather than spending the trillions earmarked for renewable energy. Here is a look at global primary energy supply comparing the year 1971 with 2016. One thing that is abundantly clear: coal, oil, and gas are dominant and likely to remain so. In 2016, fossil fuel produced 81.1% of global energy. Many countries in the world have bought into the CO2 theory and have imposed taxes on CO2 emissions. Here is a graph showing what the price impact has been. The left chart is food commodities, and the right chart is regions of the world. One thing has never been clear to me within the global CO2 cabal. What is the financial implication from the rules and regulations that are imposed worldwide, and who decides if the benefits outweigh the costs? This chart shows what a tremendous drain on resources there will be in order to meet different CO2 targets, even though it is unknown if CO2 reductions change climate in any way. After quite a bit of research, I did find an independent company that does cost-benefit models, and I studied some of their work. Here is the formulas that they use in order to do a cost-benefit of any given situation. The independent company performed a cost-benefit analysis of several CO2 emission programs that have been implemented by countries, states, and localities all over the world. I picked the California, USA Cap and Trade Act imposed by the state because it has been in place since 2006. This program imposes a price on a ton of CO2 and sells credits to industry and utilities. The program places a cap on the amount of CO2 a facility can emit and lowers the cap over time. A facility can trade or purchase credits from other facilities to enable exceeding the cap. I will read the bottom line from the analysis. It will be well more than 100 times costlier to mitigate global warming by measures such as this than to take no measures at all and adapt to such warming as may occur. End of quote. Since the implementation of this law in 2006, California companies have fled the state in large numbers. Imagine that the politicians have even figured out how to tax our air. Please take a minute and read this conclusion. Keep in mind that the CO2 theory is not proven, and for the last 20 to 30 years, climate has not shown warming differences that the IPCC claim in the failed computer models. So the enormous amounts of money spent and shutdown of nuclear power and coal-fired power is not warranted or necessary. The results from the cost-benefit model show very clearly why mitigation of global warming is economically unjustifiable. The impact of any individual mitigation strategy on CO2 emissions is so minuscule as to be in most cases undetectable, yet the cost of any such strategy is very large. Accordingly, CO2 mitigation strategies inexpensive enough to be affordable will be ineffective, while strategies costly enough to be effective will be unaffordable. The results from the model would lead us to expect that, notwithstanding the squandering of trillions in taxpayers' and energy users' funds by national governments and increasingly by global warming profiteers, mitigation strategies have had so little effect that the global mix of primary energy sources for power generation is unlikely to have changed much. Sure enough, coal, the primary target of the war on fossil fuels, had a 38% global market share in 1997 and has a 38% market share today, not least because while the West cripples its economies by closing coal-fired power stations, China alone opens at least as many new power stations per month as the West closes. China's CO2 emissions per capita are now as high as in Western countries, yet China, unlike the West, is counted as a developing country and is therefore exempted from any obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. Take a look at this slide, which shows countries by population size, and give it a think. China and India dwarf the other countries in population. These two countries are considered developing countries by the United Nations and are exempted from rules regarding CO2 emissions. Yet we receive a tremendous amount of goods from these countries once made in America. Go figure. Another interesting chart which shows the world economy. China has the second largest world economy, and they are a developing country? Go figure. Here is a chart showing the world debt. I think you get the picture from this chart. The USA has the largest debt in the world, and this gets worse every year. The U.S. debt is now more than its GDP. A lot of that debt is avoidable, but for local, state, and national programs that destroy economies. Much of the wasteful spending is to reduce CO2 and subsidize wind and solar programs. Now I'd like to show you a chart that covers the period from 1945 all the way out to 2060. This spans Truman all the way to Trump, and it shows what happened after the war. We then went into a long period of growth in the U.S. It scanned the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the oil embargo, Iraq and Iran War, the Gulf War, terrorism, and finally our war with Iraq. By 2006, when this was prepared, we had reached a peak. And the person that prepared this saw a long decline as a result of what was going on, not only with the wars, but also with the global warming, climate change issues that were beginning to take hold. It's really interesting to see what's predicted, unemployment, recessions, and by the 20s, they're expecting brownouts, blackouts, and believe it or not, some of that has begun to happen. They're seeing the long emergency, which is the alternative energy spike that the CO2 scare people are forcing upon us. When it really gets a toehold and we start seeing shortages, rationing, financial market collapses, crime and civil disorder, which has already started to begin, government collapse, which, we'll see, but a deep depression, riots and famine, scavengers, and then anarchy, all caused by all of these things that are happening now. It's very amazing, yet scary, how back in 2006, this was predicted, and so far, things are pretty much happening the way they were predicted. As you have seen in this presentation, the science of climate change, although seemingly advanced, is really still in infancy. Science has, without question, answered many phenomena since early time that has helped to expand our knowledge about the universe. But even with knowledge far beyond what is known today, humans will not have the ability to control climate, locally or globally. Many in this audience, like me, have lived far beyond the life expectancy of our forefathers. This is due in large part from the tremendous advances in living conditions made possible by fossil fuels. Also, our generation has experienced climate change firsthand. We fully understand that climate is local and changes to climate cannot be made by humans. We were born in the Little Ice Age, when winter times meant ice-covered rivers and roadways. Summers were hot and humid. World War II was fought in some of the most extreme weather conditions in our lifetime. Since those times, weather extremes around the world have not subsided, but rather followed natural cycles that have been documented and explained in science journals. In the 20th century, something new was invented nearly every day that advanced the human condition. Home heating with fossil fuel and air conditioning systems have enabled humans to live with comfort in any climate throughout the world. This has saved millions of lives. So let me get to the issue. Why would humans want to eliminate fossil fuels? The claim that the release of insignificant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere will have catastrophic implications is not proven. In contrast, it has been proven that CO2 has positive impacts on planet life. Lowering CO2 levels would surely be damaging to Earth. In fact, CO2 levels below 150 parts per million would cause the loss of most plant-based life. Others say that in addition to CO2, fossil fuels emit other emissions that will harm the planet. Although it is true that industries were a major source of pollution worldwide in the 1950s through 1970s, there has been tremendous progress since those times in the abatement of pollution from sources. All industrial sources of emissions in the United States have installed emission control systems and have for many years lowered the pollutants to well below any health risk to humans. In fact, life expectancy in the Western countries has increased from 45 years in 1945 to 68 years in 2019. This kind of improvement would have been impossible without the changing benefits that fossil fuels enable. So what needs to be done to resolve this political bias against fossil fuels, and why is it so contentious that a solution seems impossible? On the one hand, what is wrong with all electric automobiles, all electric airplanes, all electric heating and cooling, all electric home appliances? You get the picture, all electric everything. What is wrong with thinking with tunnel vision that wind and solar can provide energy for all of mankind? After all, we have really smart innovators that will solve everything as we transition to utopia for all. By the way, if this transition is not made immediately, we will all die from climate change, say those that demand the immediate elimination of all fossil fuels. On the other hand, you have the do-nothing deniers that believe the sun controls climate and that the entire CO2 thesis is not proven. With historical proof from the past and a sound scientific basis, they claim that additional CO2 is beneficial. In fact, they claim mankind could go back to the dark ages if all fossil fuels are eliminated. There is a way to compromise. Let us step back from all of the rhetoric and agree that both sides have work to do. We should not utilize politics to solve scientific problems, best solved by experienced and non-biased professionals. Clearly, half of the problem has been caused by politics and the money that drives climate scientists. This is caused by the funding of science by politicians and a media that refuse to report both sides of the climate issue. Progress was begun during the period between 2016 and 2020, when the United States declared that climate science has been corrupted and pulled out of the United Nations climate agreements. Hope springs eternal that freedom and capitalism would prevail. Progress will be halted now as the CO2 pundits ramp up the rhetoric to eliminate fossil fuels and save the world from a non-existent problem. It clearly demonstrates how political climate science has become. Wisely, the world's climate does not listen to politicians as it continues to obey the universal cycles that have always determined what kind of morning we will awaken to around the globe. All we humans can do is continue our path to improving methods for adjusting to climate as we have so remarkably done in the past 150 years. In closing, I repeat one of my favorite quotes from Bert Rutan, an aeronautical genius and a designer of aircraft and spacecraft. The engineer versus the scientist. An engineering organization, development of a product, usually under strict certification rules. Responsible for the product's worth and safety. Selling the product's adequacy to management and the public. Consequences if wrong, people die. The scientific method. Origin of new theories or hypothesis. Strict process using the scientific method to gain or lose confidence in the theory. Not responsible for adequacy or value of product. Frequently being wrong is not a problem. There you have the difference between an engineer and a scientist.
Thank you.